Before I start, hit subscribe. If you're already in here listening to my brain, you might as well claim your seat. So, let's talk about this comment that walked into my video like it was just dropping off dry cleaning. I'm 55, single, never married, no kids, therefore I'm not marketable, and I'm okay with that. On the surface, it sounds calm, simple, matter of fact, but that one word, marketable, threw a flag for me. Not his age, not his relationship status, not the no kids. Just that one word. Because that one word tells me more about his inner wiring than all the other details combined. Marketable is not a word you use about yourself unless you've been trained to think of your life like a product. That's not an insult, that's an observation. It means somewhere along the way, he got used to seeing himself in terms of demand. Not, who am I, but who wants this? Not, what do I hold, but does anybody think this is worth picking up? And I'm not dragging him for it. A lot of people do that without ever saying it out loud. He just happened to type the line everyone else keeps in their head, but here's where I disconnect. I don't move through life like that. I don't wake up and mentally check whether I'd pass some invisible relationship market test. I don't describe myself like I'm giving a status update to a focus group. Not because I've never been single, not because I've never felt unwanted, but because at some point I sat down and actually figured out who the hell I am when nobody else is in the room. Once you do that, marketable stops being a category that makes sense. When you haven't met yourself yet, it's very easy to think in those terms. You've got numbers, age, history, kids or no kids. You've got social expectations. By this age, you should have done this. By that age, you should have had that. You've got comparisons. Other people's lives lined up like a display case. Put all that together and suddenly you're not a person anymore. You're a scorecard. And if your scorecard doesn't look like what you were taught it should, it feels safer to say, I'm not marketable and I'm fine with it, than to admit I don't actually know how to see myself outside of that frame. That's what I hear in that sentence. Not failure, not lack, just a man using a system to rate himself that never should have been applied to a human being in the first place. When I finally looked at myself honestly, it wasn't because I was in some Zen space with candles and affirmations. It was because life cornered me. I reached a point where the way I was moving didn't match what I knew I carried, and I couldn't blame anyone else for that anymore. So I did the thing most people avoid. I sat with it. No audience, no distraction, no performance. And I didn't like what I saw. Not because I was horrible, but because I could finally see the separation between who I really was and who I'd been trained to be. I saw beliefs I'd picked up just because they were handed to me. I saw habits that made sense in old environments, but were completely useless now. I saw places where I'd shrunk myself because it was easier to be tolerated than to be honest. It wasn't dramatic, it was just clear. And clear hurts before it helps. But once you've had that kind of meeting with yourself, your language changes. Not because you're trying to sound powerful. It just can't stay the same. You stop describing yourself in terms of whether you're appealing to some imaginary audience. You stop narrating your story like a commercial. You move from, am I wanted, to, am I aligned with who I actually am? That's the real shift. A person who hasn't done that work will talk like, I'm not marketable. A person who has done that work might say, I don't fit what people expect, and I'm living anyway. Those are two completely different positions. One is quietly apologizing for existing outside the template. The other is simply acknowledging reality and continuing to build. What he wrote is not evil. It's not pathetic. It's not ridiculous. It's just unfinished. It stops at, how do I look on paper? And never moves into who am I when there is no paper. And that's where my irritation is. Not at him, but at the whole system that tells people their worth is attached to how well they fit a formula someone else invented. If you've spent your whole life hearing that being successful means you have certain boxes checked, partner, kids, status, milestones, then of course you'll look at yourself through that grid. You could be sharp, kind, self-aware, funny, solid, and still decide you're not marketable because you don't match a story that was never written with you in mind. The problem isn't the person, it's the measuring stick. Once you start questioning the measuring stick, everything starts shifting. You realize a lot of the labels you've used on yourself were never neutral. They were loaded with other people's expectations. You start noticing how often you've made statements about yourself that weren't facts. They were conclusions drawn from bad data. I'm too old. According to who? I missed my chance. Compared to what? I'm not marketable. By which standard exactly? You don't even have to argue with the answers. You just have to be honest about where they came from. That's the part most people skip. They don't dig down to the source. They don't trace the sentence back to its origin. They just accept it as truth because it's familiar. Familiar doesn't mean accurate. It just means you've heard it enough times that you stopped checking. When that man said, "I'm not marketable," I didn't hear a verdict, I heard a script. A well-practiced, well-worn, emotionally safe little script. It protects him from hope. If you declare early that you're off the market, you don't risk much. You don't have to be disappointed. You don't have to explore. You don't have to ask harder questions like, if I'm not those roles, then who am I? Because that's the real question underneath all of this. If you are not your relationship status, not your age, not your checklist, what's left? And here's where I get blunt. If you don't know that answer, of course, you'll lean on words like marketable. It gives you something to say about yourself without actually revealing anything real. It's a shield. It sounds resigned, but it's actually protective. If you call yourself not marketable, no one can reject you. You rejected yourself first. Efficient, but expensive. There is another way to move, and it does not require pretending you're thrilled about everything. It just requires taking yourself seriously enough to define yourself from the inside out rather than the outside in. That's not hype. That's work. It looks like paying attention to what drains you versus what steadies you. It looks like noticing where you soften and where you shut down. It looks like being honest about patterns instead of narrating them with cute phrases. It looks like acknowledging, I've been telling myself this story for years. Do I still believe it? Or am I just used to hearing it? The funny thing is, once you start doing that, nothing outside you has to change for you to stop talking like you're past your expiration date. The man in that comment could wake up tomorrow with the same age, same history, same everything, and still speak about himself differently if he stopped using market language to talk about a human life. He could say, I'm 55, single, never married, no kids, and I'm finally figuring out what I want the rest of my life to actually feel like. He could say, I don't fit most people's picture, and that's fine. I'm not building my life for most people anymore. He could say nothing at all and just quietly live in a way that reflects who he is, instead of what he thinks will sell. That's the difference I care about. Not whether someone couples up, not whether they follow some prescriptive path, but whether they stop reading their own life like rejection letters and start seeing it as something they still have the power to author. You can be single and miserable. You can be married and miserable. You can have kids and feel empty. You can have no kids and feel free. None of those setups guarantee meaning. They just give your story props. The content still has to come from you. So when I heard, I'm not marketable and I'm okay with that, what I wanted to say back wasn't, yes, you are, or no, you're not. I have no interest in arguing his label. What I wanted to say is, you don't have to use that kind of language on yourself at all. You are allowed to take your life out of that category altogether. You're not a product. You're not inventory. You're not a discontinued model. You're not waiting for a buyer. You are allowed to be a person whose worth is not up for review. And once you claim that, quietly, privately, without making a speech about it, the way you talk about yourself will change. You won't need to announce that you're not marketable. The whole idea will feel as outdated as dial-up internet. Not because your circumstances shifted, but because your perspective finally caught up with your actual value. If that happens, you won't need anyone online, including me, to reassure you. You won't need the comment section to clap. You'll know. And once you know, you cannot unknow. Have you ever actually dated yourself, the real you, not the version you perform, not the one you hope people accept? I'm talking about the one you can't even look at in the mirror without flinching. Have you ever sat with that person long enough to let them speak? All right, that's it. Hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one, because if I have to drag you into your own self-awareness again, you're going to want the notification.